Good afternoon. As Indigenous peoples, we have a spiritual memory that guides us to honor others. So I begin by raising my hands in deep appreciation and reverence to our respected Simgi'gat, our chiefs, our Sigidimnaks, our matriarchs of these beautiful lands and waterways. I also show my appreciation to our current and our past respected leaders and ancestors that have valiantly fought so hard for us to keep our cultures and our languages alive. A big Twixinism to Shannon and to the conference organizers and to all of you who are staying for the very last presentation of the day to listen to our rematriation story. We also have so many people we have to thank and show our gratitude towards who helped us with our common bowl efforts in bringing our totem pole home. But for our time today, what we hope to do with our panel is to be able to first hear from Ts'aawit Chief Nisga'a himself about the cultural origins of our totem pole and its relation and our connection to our family history and to our nation. And then following that, we're going to invite Mr. Andrew Robinson, who will be joining us through Zoom. And Mr. Andrew Robinson is the Chief Executive Officer for the Nisga'a Lands government. And he's going to provide a little bit more about our historical and the political context of the Nisga'a Final Agreement and how that configured into our rematriation case. Following that, I'm going to invite Theresa Schober, who is currently the Nisga'a Museum Curator and Director, and she's going to share a little bit about the history of the Nisga'a Museum and how that connects to the Nisga'a Treaty and to the current efforts that we made, and as well as a previous rematriation story that happened prior to our case and how that also impacted our work. And then following that, we're grateful to have Dr. John Giblin, who will be joining us from the National Museums of Scotland, who is up very late in Kenya, waiting to share his perspective of the claim and his works that he did behind the scenes with the National Museums of Scotland. And then as a close, we're going to just share some strategies and some tips that we learned along the way from our rematriation case. And Pamela Brown will talk about some of the emotional and the spiritual impacts of the work that we did. So without any further ado, I'd like to invite Ts'aawit Nisga'a, Mr. Earl Stevens, to share a little bit about our totem pole.
Aama says, listen, ook net ooit ze mogen Laxha genaamd Aama zegt kun Hlaa, Wilps Wilps, Laxgalt'sap, Nism. I'd like to thank the Creator for giving us this time to share this day with you all, these last 3 days, which was very, very moving with the experience that we went through. My name is Earl Stevens. My Nisga'a name is Ts'aawit Nisga'a. I come from the Nisga'a Nation. It's northwest in British Columbia. Before I go on with the story about the pole, I'd like you to tell you the beginning of the story, where it all starts. And years ago, I had a great-great-great-grandmother that had this totem pole made in her name, carved by one of the Nisga'a carvers. My great-great-great-grandmother had 4 daughters, and one of them was my grandmother, and she had 21 children. So I had 18 uncles and 3 aunties, and one of the aunts was my mom. So there was 21 in total, and that was just from one of the 3 sisters from her great-great-great-grandmother. along the way, with my uncles still around, there were still 9 of them with us. And I came back from high school, and I got to be around the ones that were left with us. And they made me stand with them and said that I'll be the next chief. So they made me a sub-chief. And to the day they were telling the story about the totem pole that belonged to us, and it ended up in Scotland, and they heard by one of the master carvers that carved, and he was doing some research and poles throughout Europe, and he told of this totem pole that was in Scotland, and it belonged to the house of Nisga'a. So by the time my uncles got to speaking to the family and talking that they were getting ready to go over, they wanted to bring the pole back home. And in their time, everything was just, they didn't get to stay around. They all have passed on. So upon this, I took it upon myself to see if I can help the family in getting our pole back. This was such an emotional time for me, because even when I started this in my heart, it just started reaching to me. My uncles decided over there to bring the pole back home, but they didn't make it. The importance of our great-great-grandmother had this totem pole raised in her name, because back then she also had a nephew, and back in the day, the Nass River, which flows just off the coast, is quite a river that supplied the abundance of seafood for our nation. So there was a lot of fights in the area with different nations, and my great-grandmother's nephew was killed in battle along there in fighting for the land. He was battling in protecting the land. And this is in memory of our great-great-great-grandmother. And this pole, because he had it, we are, in our culture, we are spiritual people. And this pole was a living being. And these things don't just come down on their own. So the pole stands, and when it falls back to Mother Earth on its own. But this pole didn't happen. It was cut down, stolen and taken away. It was taken down the river by a barge and taken into the nearest town, which was Prince Rupert, and then loaded onto a train to take back east, and then loaded onto a ship there and taken across to Scotland, where the pole was sold to. But in our family, because this is so spiritual, we feel it, and it's alive. So to us, in our hearts, it was always with us when we found out where it was. And the feeling of just bringing it home and knowing that this is what my family would have wanted, all my uncles that were there, in trying to get it home. The pole was taken in 1929. So it was gone from us for over 100 years. The pole stood in the Museum of Scotland till about a year ago. And my great-great-great-grandmother, she passed on when she was 115 years old. And her husband was 105. And back in the day, he sat on the first treaty for natives in Canada on the 1913 petition. So I thought I'd tell you this part before I have Dr. Amy Parent here tell you the rest of the journey home with the pole. Thank you.
Well, we're grateful for your memory and for your leadership within our house and for everything that you've done in order to retain its importance to our family and carrying that forward and encouraging the rest of us in the next generation. So my Nisga'a name is Noxs, Nisga'a, Amy Parent Wamaye. And I am also one of the ancestral granddaughters of Joanna Moody, and Ts'aawit Nisga'a here is my uncle. And in my spare time, when I'm not out, being tasked to support a totem pole rematriation, I'm also a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Education and Governance, Tier 2 at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver on Squamish and Ts'aawit territories. And just a little bit more context to our family, we come from the Ganiye'etguḿ, or the Frog Clan, and we come from the village of Laxgalt'sap in the Nisga'a Nation. And here on the slide behind me is our house crest that was drawn by my brother, Ts'aawit, Calvin McNeil. But just to talk a little bit more about our history, I'd like to invite Mr. Andrew Robinson to join us and to talk about the political context of our nation for those who are unfamiliar with us.
Can you hear me now? I think that's a yes. You can hear me, John? I can't tell if anybody else can because all I see is a tight navy. So I am, my name is Andrew Robinson. My Nisga'a name is Apdii Laxha. I am from the Nisga'a tribe. I have been born into the Nisga'a Nation, and I thought it would be profound and wonderful for me to be sitting in a room today with this gentleman behind me, and we call this the Frank Calder room at the Lisims government. And the table is shaped like a Hiyukwhl, which is a copper shield, which signifies our wealth. And they used to be utilized to show connection in our land and across our territories in a traditional sense, as Ts'aawit Nisga'a has done. So Sigidimnak, Wilps, Ts'aawit Laxha, Aama, Aslam, Luu-diyaltkwhl, Ts'aawit Nisga'a, Sigidimnak, Noxs, Hlgu. The manner in which the chief had brought forward his family's fight for the last 100 years to find the connection with the Ts'aawit memorial pits and was one that all of our families and all of our nations have been tracking for a long while. under the Nisga'a Final Agreement, which was an agreement that was signed, initialed in 1999 and came into effect in 2000. The Nisga'a Treaty provided a self-governing model for the Nisga'a Nation between the government of British Columbia and the government of Canada after the Frank Calder case really basically told the colonial powers that be here in Canada that they could not just take the land, that they actually had to negotiate some form of arrangements and with the people that were residing along the Lisims, which we are called the people actually of the Ganiye'etguḿ Lisims, the people that belong to that river. So the Nisga'a Nations government is a constitutional government protected under the Canadian Constitution and is also entrenched in what Nisga'a was sharing with you was what we call our Hlgu, our law. Our laws are a collection of laws between respective Wilps or house groups that have been in this area for thousands of years. The community of Laxgalt'sap that Dr. Parent and Nisga'a, Pamela and Theresa and myself that we reside in has had remains unearthed by accident in it that are over 8,000 years old, 6,000 years old, 200 years old. We found graves all over the place with many people buried in those places. And we're also adjacent to two of the largest places that Pitsand were stolen from back in the early 1900s, late 1800s, all the way up until 1950 was when some of the last stuff was stolen in our valley. We say stolen because they were basically had removed the stuff without our consent and were provided, or the government's anthropologist, Maurice Barbeau, came and took them. And meanwhile, in the community of Laxgalt'sap, which became a reserve known as Greenville, where the Nisga'a land question began, the totem poles were actually seen to be drifted down the river while people were watching them being taken away from the ancestral community of Enkida, which I brought Nisga'a and Dr. Parent to Gidix, where some of the most famous Canadian painters had painted portraits of our totem poles before they were cut down and removed and sent and gifted to museums or sold to museums for a little bit of money all over the country, all over the world. And one of the big pieces that allowed us to have a real kind of presence in the discussions with the Nisga'a memorial pole was the fact that Nisga'a had actually engaged with the village, with Dr. Amy Parent, in the rematriation of this pole. And they re-engaged with the village and talked to the village government about standing with them and providing them that local government authority from the community, which in turn connected them to the Nisga'a Lisims government. And the Nisga'a Lisims government was the body that has a tripartite arrangement to have discussions with BC and Canada in regards to wrongful removal of items, or to be able to have discussions with other states or other groups in regards to items that pertain to Nisga'a culture, language, history, or anything else that is found there. We have actually 4 village governments: the Nisga'a village of Goothl, the Nisga'a village of Laxgalt'sap, the Nisga'a village of Giblin, and the Nisga'a village of Giblin, and 3 urban locals and close to 9,000 citizens, around North America and in Europe. And when we engaged with them on that front, we really were shocked that BC basically just took a step back because they were intertwined in this discussion about what DRIPA and UNDRIP meant to them, because they created the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act in British Columbia. And while they were doing that, we as the Nisga'a people showed up at their offices and said, That's all fine and dandy that you're recognizing the rights of Indigenous people, but you have a constitutionally protected treaty here that you must uphold, and you must provide us some rights and insight into to ensure that people across the board are aware that we are a distinct governing body and a self-governing nation that has the rights to engage and work with other people. So BC cleared the path for us. Then when we got to Canada, we got over to Scotland and informed Canada that we were going to Scotland, and Canada turned around and said to us at that time, we'll contact the High Commissioner in the United Kingdom and inform him that you guys are going over there to go through this pole project and go see your pole, and then we'll provide advice and support to you guys while you're over there. And we have no say on what you guys are doing because you are a self-governing nation. So as of the start of that process, we were really kind of starting to flex our treaty muscles. And many people kind of probably stepped back and looked at us and said, who are these group of First Nations people that just arrived in Scotland, showed up in the museum and said, we want our pole back, and this is why, and you're going to give it back to us based on this, and this is how you're going to work with us to undo this wrong and tell the true story about our history as Nisga'a people and Scottish people together. And by taking that route and working hard with the family and supporting the family, that's what our self-government model was designed to do. We have a council of elders that provided guidance to the executive of our government, which is made up of a president, a secretary, treasurer, a chairperson, and all of them provided that support and those resources to the family to say, what does the Ts'aawit and his Wilp need to get across the line, and how do we all stand behind them to invigorate our traditional house structures and lift them up as a self-governing nation. And what Nisga'a did, and what Dr. Amy Parent did, was they provided a pathway for us to realize on the true potential of what self-government means. It wasn't just about the constitutional pieces that we were being protected with about our rights specific as Nisga'a. It offered us an opportunity to really envelop the modern treaty, and it offered us the opportunity to bring in that traditional knowledge and combine them together and create this sphere of just absolute power that was presented to the government of Scotland, presented to the people of the world to say, we need to fix this history so we can move forward in a better way. And so that's one of the things that I really wanted to bring into the equation today, because I think that with modern treaties and what we have in constitutionally protected rights versus asserted rights is far different, and offered us a far easier pathway in to have a good discussion with the government of Scotland, the National Museum of Scotland, the government of Canada, the government of British Columbia, and then back again to all the other regional governments, and then bringing them all in the envelope, and then us as a government, self-governing nation turning to Nisga'a and his family going, okay, they're going to give it back now. What do you guys want to do? And so we had to figure all of that out after we got to the phase of what are we going to do. So I'll leave it at that for the rest of the panel.
Well, thank you, Mr. Robinson. And I should also add that he was also a member of our delegation that came to Scotland with us twice. And hopefully you're able to stay on for a little while longer before your next meeting so you can share the story of the Canadian Armed Forces when we get to that place. But right now I'd also like to introduce Theresa Schober, and she's just going to talk about the origins of our Nisga'a Museum, and also a former repatriation that happened prior to our totem pole coming home, and how that also really supported our work.
Good afternoon, everybody. The delegation that went to Scotland, which Amy Parent and Chief Nisga'a led, was a family-driven effort. And as Andrew Robinson was mentioning, the village government supported the family, came on board to support the family, and then the national government, the Nisga'a Nation, came on board to support the government. Nisga'a Museum is a unit of that national government. It's the National Museum of the Nisga'a Nation. And so it was about a month before the delegation went to Scotland that, because the family had decided that the placement of the memorial pole when it would be returned would come to the museum. Chief Earl had relayed to me that he wanted the memorial pole to continue to tell its story to visitors who came to the valley and to community members who had a place to come and visit it. And so it was the family's desire for it to come back to the museum. And so for that reason alone, myself as the museum director in the valley was added to the delegation. The museum itself is an interesting place. It is in the village of Laxgalt'sap, so it is on traditional territory, ancestral territory. It's a new construction. It is actually outside of what was originally reserve lands. All of the cultural belongings that are contained within the museum are repatriated. When the Nisga'a I feel like you shouldn't clap for me there, but I know you're clapping for the nation. I was not involved in those early efforts, but they go back far. As the Nisga'a negotiated their treaty, which was in total a 113-year process from their initial land claim until the ratification of the Nisga'a Final Agreement, in those conversations, they required of their treaty partners that cultural belongings of their selection would return to the Nass Valley. And here's a couple of historical photos in the nation's archive that show some very key members, some of whom have since passed. The late Joseph Gosnell, Eva Clayton, who's now the president of the Nisga'a Nation, and a number of other senior chiefs, matriarchs, and community stakeholders, elders, participated in visits to the Canadian Museum of History, which is the flagship museum institution for the Government of Canada, and the Royal BC Museum, which is the equivalent for the treaty partner of British Columbia. And they identified cultural belongings that they wished to have return with the treaty. All of these visits were done in the 1990s, and then the treaty, once it was signed, it included an appendix that listed each of these cultural belongings. The unfortunate elements of this era, 1990s, 2000s, it was before institutions were willing to completely let go, not that we're entirely there yet, but as this story unfolds, some institutions are closer to letting go than they were in the early 1990s. And so the nation had requirements, conditions on the return of cultural belongings, which included the construction of a grade A facility with 20 tons of HVAC units to control the humidity and control the access and security to the cultural belongings that they received back, essentially to stretch out into the future those conservation practices of the colonial institutions from which the cultural belongings had originally been taken from the Nass Valley and were being held at. And so there were conditions placed on that early repatriation. And the Nisga'a Museum, which the previous photograph showed this beautiful 10,000 square foot facility that's in the village of Laxgalt'sap, was constructed with those goals in mind. However, the nation also did things differently, and the cultural belongings that are in this space are treated in a much more culturally appropriate way in a lot of different arenas. And that's not really the point of today's presentation, but I'll just mention a couple of things quickly. The return of the belongings was what was significant. That community members would have access to their belongings was what was significant. Almost all of the cultural items that were returned are on permanent display. There is not a storeroom where community members do not have access to their cultural belongings. things were not placed under glass. Things are not labeled in English. Instead, the museum has a model granted by these stakeholders and elders that participated in the conversations about how it would run, that youth and young adults from the community each year serve as interpreters, and they guide people through the museum, and they relay the stories, the oral histories of the cultural belongings, the stories they hear from their yets and their jijis about what it means. And all of that communication and interaction makes it a very, very different place, but still with some seeds of colonial overreach from that earlier era of when belongings returned.
Thank you, Theresa. So I'm going to join the story, and if I didn't lose my notes here. Okay. So I'll just say that when I first heard about our poll, I joined the story quite late. It was almost 4 years ago, and it was upon a visit to Ts'aawit Nisgaa''s house. And I'd been doing some other research with the nation around language revitalization. And so during that time, I'd found some spiritual, sensitive information in our archives that I thought that Ts'aawit Nisga'a needed to hear about, because I didn't know what to do with it. And upon hearing that I had a language revitalization grant, he asked me if I had any extra funding available. And I said, well, it has to be targeted towards language. He said, okay, well, we have a totem pole, a replica pole of our original pole that's in Scotland, and we still need the steel reinforcements to get it raised, and I hope we can do that in 4 months' time at our feast. And up until that time, I really didn't know how expensive it was to raise a totem pole. And I told him I'll do my best. I can go out and I can write a grant, but I'm an academic, so it's not going to come right away. It could take 6 months. And he said, okay, well, while you're at it, can you find some more information on our original pole? There's a name on there. I want to learn a little bit more about that history of that name, and maybe that museum has that information. And so that's how I became involved. One of the other things, as I went away and began to do research, he also had told me that prior to the ratification of the Nisga'a Final Agreement, that we did have a delegation go through and go to this museum in Scotland where a pole was. And at that time, the delegation had been informed that the pole was too old to be moved. And when I went away and did research, I quickly discovered that since that time, the pole had been moved in the museum due to their own internal renovations. And so that made me very angry, and that also made me write into the grant. It was a Social Science Humanities Research Council of Canada grant for research, that we would go as a delegation, and we would go to Scotland and tell them that we wanted the pole returned. And so we were really grateful to have a team of amazing people that you can see here in the slide behind me join us. And one of the things that we've felt throughout our journey is that our ancestral grandmother has always guided us in bringing us the right people at the right time with the right gifts. And certainly I think that's one thing that I would recommend, is always ensuring that you have a good team when you go in to do these types of negotiations. And I think we also went with one of our strongest gifts as Nisga'a peoples. We went with our hearts and our minds working as one, and we were very much working in unity towards bringing our pole home. And so upon arrival to the museum, we expressed to the museum and later its board, and then to a cabinet secretary for the Scottish government, that our reason for coming to Scotland was that we wanted our children to wake up every day and not have to search so hard for the stories of who we are. And that we wanted them to know these stories with every breath that they take. And we wanted them to know our family history and to be close to our precious family member. We also felt it was important to talk to the Scottish people about our troubling imperial and colonial history that we've all inherited, but we also have the ability to change in our future for our children. And so in terms of the research design, I won't go into too many details, but I would like to show reverence to a dear mentor of mine who trained me throughout all of my academic training, and that's Dr. Joanna Archibald from the Ts'aawit Nation. And I draw upon her work, especially her story work methodology, because it's really so central to the work that we do as Indigenous peoples. And in particular, within the field of Indigenous education, we work with stories, and that allows others to take their own meaning from stories and not just give kind of a checkpoint list in terms of how to follow a procedure. And I think what's also important within a Canadian context is that we do have stories enshrined within our Canadian legal system. So we had a 1997 Delgamuukw decision through the Supreme Court of Canada, which was issued through Chief Justice Lamar, who recognized in Canadian law that oral histories both embody historical knowledge and they express cultural values. And there's a quote that I'd like to share, and it comes from a novelist, Ben Okri. And he says that people are as healthy and as confident as the stories they tell themselves. Sick stories can make their nations sick, and sick nations make for sick storytellers. So it feels very important for us to continue disrupting the stories that have founded the disciplines, as well as the imperial and the colonial empires that continue to benefit from these stories, and all the acquisitions that come from these stories. And so with our story, we hope to be able to share the rewriting of history and a story of reclamation, of resurgence, resistance, reconciliation, rematriation, and reparation. Okay, the slide's missing, but I had two pictures of some beautiful living matriarchs within our community. And so, as I hinted at, I never went to totem pole rematriation school. My background is in education, and that's why I focus on stories and ways of working with people and sort of practical examples in my practice. So when I first kind of came into this world, I humbly know very little still about museum practices, but I do work in a higher education setting, and I am familiar with challenging and trying to decolonize colonial structures. But one of the things that struck me after a couple of years of working on this project was the term repatriation itself. And as I began to think about it, and I thought about the fact that we as Nisga'a people are matrilineal, and that our totem pole had been commissioned by a matriarch in our nation, that the term rematriation no longer resonated with me, and that we needed to think about it in broader terms and think about it as a rematriation. And so, as Ts'aawit Nisga'a has alluded to, Joanna Moody lived to be 115 years old. And when we began to look at the history of her commissioning this pole, I discovered that she was around 25 to 35 years in age when she had her totem pole commissioned. And so for me, that really tells me the kind of person that she was, and that talks about the strength that she had as a matriarch. She became a matriarch at one of the most challenging times in her history as Nisga'a peoples, a time of deep genocide. And it was also a time of deep grief, as she had to honor a family member who'd fallen, protecting our sovereignty as a nation. And she did the right thing. She did the right thing, and she was able to support the carving of a new totem pole, which during that time would have taken about 1 to 2 years. And our family and she would have been solely responsible for providing for the carvers during that entire time and looking after them until the totem pole was carved. And so just returning to the term rematriation, that's why it's important for us to use this word and to recognize its linkages to us as a matrilineal society, and to just honor Joanna for everything that she did. And in thinking about repatriation, and especially with our interactions with the museum that we worked with, I did see that that it's very still much steeped in patriarchal and paternalistic Eurocentric practices, logics, and laws. And so we were very clear, as Andrew had alluded to, when we went to the National Museums of Scotland, that we would center our own laws and our own ways of knowing in having it being returned to us. Also important for us to recognize that as matriarchs within our society, they hold important leadership roles that are to be in balance with our respected chiefs and our beloved family members in our houses, our clans, and our nations in order to support our governance needs moving forward. I also recognize that we too have been impacted by the Indian Act, and that this is an ongoing process because of the harms of colonialism. It's also a process where we welcome our men and our Two-Spirit and our non-binary peoples in to support us in order to redress this balance in a good way. And we have an expression in our language, which is Sigidimnak, which is to work together with one heart, one mind, one nation. I also recognize that the term rematriation will only work for nations that are matrilineal, and that we are very diverse as Indigenous peoples. And so one of the things I was very happy about in the work that we have done recently, and with our communication strategy in particular for this rematriation, was that we were able to shift some of the discourse with media and create more public awareness around the term rematriation. And now, just recently, I've also seen that we've also started to change some of the government literature from the Canadian government. And so now we're seeing rematriation and repatriation being included together. But certainly it's a practice, it's an ongoing action, and it can't be just a word, and it's something we have to embody and we have to continue working towards. So I'm kind of going a little bit backwards in terms of the research project, but one of the things that I discovered when I did go into the archives was that our pole had been stolen by colonial ethnographer Marius Barbeau in 1929. And we had a discussion last night, Theresa and I, and she said, you know, Amy, you have 3 slides of an old dead white guy. Do you really want to be upholding this fellow into an Indigenous setting like this? And I said, I think it's very important that we continue to challenge the damage done by these early ethnographers and not let them off the hook so easily. I did my first degree in anthropology, and I still remember being told that he was one of the great white fathers of our discipline. And I also got reprimanded in one of my essays while I was doing my undergraduate degree because I critiqued him and talked about all the harms that he did. This is before I even know he stole our family's totem pole. But my professor made me go back and write, and they said I had to be more balanced and appreciate what he did in terms of preserving our culture. And so this is part of the reason why I'm showing his slides and talking about it. And we're also very much aware, and this was probably the next stage of the journey that's going to happen, I would imagine in the springtime once the snow melts in Quebec. But there are still museums in Canada, in Quebec in particular, that really revere Marius Barbeau, and they're not telling a complicated story of him. Definitely not our story, and so I think that's the steps ahead, at least for me, in terms of some of the activism and some of the changing of that narrative that we need to continue to control in a better way. So what was helpful for Marius Barbeau and the notes that I learned from were a few things. He was very well documented as an early ethnographer, so his trail was fairly easy to track. But he admitted to taking the pole, where he took it from, how he took it, and then the third thing that was really helpful for our claim was that he identified that he'd been given permission by the government of Canada to do that. And in particular, it was Duncan Campbell Scott, who was superintendent of Indian Affairs at that time. And so for folks who aren't familiar of who Duncan Campbell Scott was, he was a very infamous figure in Canadian history. He was a creator of the residential school system in Canada, and he was also the man who signed off on giving Barbeau permission to take our totem pole. So that was important for us in terms of our claim and some of the solidarity work that we did later on with the Canadian government in order to get our totem pole home and get them to pay for the costs. And then along the way, as some of the first steps, before we went to the museum, I felt it was important to challenge the colonial archive by writing a book chapter and other literature. And so I was really grateful to be able to work with Ts'aawit Duke, Chief William Moore from our nation. And he had the oral history of the totem pole being removed down the Nass River. And so we co-wrote a book chapter where we talked about that theft. And one of the other interesting things that I found in some of the archives in Scotland, and the Scotsman newspaper in particular, was there was one section there where the reporter interviewed the crew that had taken the totem pole, and they talk about this terrible storm that had come up the river, and they talked about how the bad spiritual juju that they had from the moment they took that pole until the moment they got to Scotland. And so to me, even then, they could feel it. They could feel the spiritual misalignment of what they were doing. The interesting thing in the newspaper article was that they were dismissed by the journalists for being superstitious, but they knew what they were doing, and they could feel it. So we also brought that forward in our claim. And what this book chapter ended up doing was supporting us in terms of some of the evidence that we needed. And so that was included in our written submission for the claim when we did go to Scotland. And the other thing I felt was really important, even before writing the book chapter, was just to get an understanding of the context and trying to make relationships with other critical academics in that area. Knowing, number one, that I don't specialize in that area, but number two, I really wanted to understand what some of the logics and some of the arguments that we might face and encounter. And so going to these conferences and meeting people also enabled me to create a network of people that could support us. And one of the things I also reflected upon is it's always been the women of academia that have always stepped forward to help us first. Women of all nations and from all different places. And you always know who your supporters are. These are the women that stepped forward to help me and believe me in the very beginning days before we had grants and before we had anybody supporting us. And so just really grateful for the relationships that they facilitated, because it was a time of COVID and there's no way I could have gotten on the plane to go over there and meet people, but they really facilitated and supporting that relationship building that also helped us. So here's a picture of the pole in Angida before it was stolen, and then there's a picture of the totem pole, which I learned later on that was about the second time it had been moved in the museum, and by the time we showed up at the museum it had been moved one more time, but that's how it looked at probably the 1970s or 1980s, but John Giblin can tell you exactly when that photo was taken. And that's the distance that the totem pole traveled from Scotland back home to our territories. So Uncle Earl had alluded to the importance of totem poles for us. But, you know, for our house poles, they represent who we are, but they talk about our rights and our titles to the land. They tell our stories of our ancestors. They're basically, for me, a living curriculum, right? And so they're very important in terms of sharing our family history. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our first meeting with the National Museums of Scotland. So on August 22nd, we arrived to communicate directly with the National Museums of Scotland. We communicated that we expected the return of our totem pole without conditions before we left Scotland on August 26th. We were very grateful for the reception we received from the museum staff. We had some prior correspondence with them, and it was clear that they really wanted to greet us in a way that was culturally respectful. We explained our traditions, our customs, and our protocols when we took over during our arrival into the building. And we explained the significance of our songs, our oral stories, and the crests that tell the story of the life of that totem pole that rested in the museum. We came dressed in our ceremonial Nisga'a regalia, our button blankets, and we led with a song that displayed our crests on the back so that museum staff could bear witness to our laws and to our protocols. And then our family marched into the museum, led by the museum staff, with one of our songs that comes from the ancient village of Angida, where the pole was stolen from. We were singing as a family, but we also were singing to the pole as a way to reawaken it. And during that time, right up until we walked into the room, our emotions were so palpable. And as we got closer to that room, we could feel the pole itself. And for me, that was really the first time I could ever feel a totem pole. And so in this picture, that was the moment that it felt like the room was breathing. And I turned around and I talked to my cousin Shauna, who's right behind me, and I said, "Can you feel that?" And she said, "Yeah." She goes, "It's like a weight came off of my shoulders. They're happy, they're relieved that we're here." And I know Uncle Earl had been feeling it since Vancouver, and it was a huge, I guess, current of emotion. So following that, our orator, Apdii expressed our desire and our intentions to come there, and we led with a peace song that demonstrated that we wanted to have good relations with the museum. So after that, we gave witness gifts to all the museum staff and thanked them for being in the room with us, because initially they wanted to leave, and we said no, we wanted them to feel our emotions and witness what we were going through, and we felt like that was also professional development for them. After that, we were brought into a room, and that's where our negotiations started. And that's also where we felt the clash of our two different knowledge systems, our laws and our governance. In our oral testimony to the National Museums of Scotland, we indicated that we expected the return of the pole without condition to our house and to the Nisga'a Lands in a 3-day time frame. We also expected that our law and our protocols would be centered and respected, rather than following a procedure that was dictated by Scottish legislation. We informed them that we had reviewed their new policy, and it's a bit of a mouthful, but John, I'm going to give it a go here. It's called the Procedure for Considering Requests for the Permanent Transfer or Collection of Objects to Non-UK Claimants. We expressed that this policy was not relevant for a discussion. And we explained that we're not just talking about semantics, but we saw that there was a fundamental different ontological and epistemological difference in understanding the living and the spiritual nature of the pole, and as was shared so eloquently by our hereditary leadership that was there that day. We explained that sacred belongings are not museum objects that can be owned, and that museum procedures only relate to belongings as property. And we provided evidence that the pole was more than an object, property, or a cultural artifact that they could own. We also highlighted important international law, and we talked about Canada's constitution that had entrenched the Nisga'a Final Agreement in our nationhood status. And the media advocacy that we did prior to our arrival in Scotland, we also pointed out that the UK was a signatory of UNDRIP, and we hoped that they were going to honor that. We also talked about the need to open up the conversation further beyond this policy, because we were very much aware that the policy was garnering total control over our family's living memorial pole to the museum, and then later to the Board of Trustees that would ultimately make the decision on whether or not it would be returned to us. One of the things we were really disappointed about upon our first arrival into the building was to discover that there was nobody present from the board. And when we inquired about that, they informed us that the museum board needed to remain objective, and that they couldn't interact with us because they'd have to make the final decision. To which we responded, there is no such thing in objectivity in a colonial institution that has total power over our belongings. There is no such thing as objectivity. And in fact, when we think about the words of Peter Cole, Western objectivity is really a form of Western subjectivity. So we pressured the museum in that first meeting that we really wanted to meet with the chair of the board. And so within a 2-day time frame, that was agreed upon. And so we were grateful in the meeting with the chair of the board that they also agreed to provide us access to other Nisga'a cultural belongings that were housed within the institution, that they acknowledged that oral tradition would be the equivalency to written word when we continued our discussions with them. And they also agreed to make immediate changes to how the pole was being housed. And at the urging of our delegation, I had to reconsider our 3-day time frame. And it was shared with me that we might want to consider it might take more than a few days for us to figure out what to do if we actually did get the totem pole home. At that point in time, our Nisga'a Lands government was on summer vacation, and then we still needed to communicate with Canada and BC in terms of how we would get it home and who would pay for that. So I had to give up my impatience and my 3-day deadline, and we decided a 3-month deadline to hear back from the museum on whether or not it was going to be returned would proceed. One of the things we also discovered during that meeting was that our advocacy with the media was working, and that was certainly a sore spot. And so we had also ensured that upon the end of our first day that we had meetings, we had press interviews with major Canadian newspapers, outlets, as well as the Scottish media in order to report what had happened during those meetings. And we could feel that that was some tension there with the museum that was productive for us. We also had a meeting the next day booked with a Scottish government official, and at that point it was somebody who perhaps had a little bit less reach politically, but because of the pressure of that first meeting, we got a phone call that night and we were escalated up to a cabinet minister. And so we were really grateful to go into a second meeting with Mr. Angus Robertson, who was the Scottish government's cabinet secretary for the Constitutional of External Affairs and Culture. And during that meeting, we felt a noticeable shift in his response to us about our negotiations. And I know he's a politician, and I've seen crocodile tears, but he seemed to have a genuine heart in terms of his expression and his emotions and how he received us. He was clear that he also had to allow culture to follow its processes before politics could get involved, and that he would have to wait for a decision from the board before he could do anything. But he did say that he would do his best to expedite a decision to us as quickly as possible, and that he did want to have a continued relationship with us as Nisga'a peoples. And so that was our first trip to Scotland, and we had a lot of work we had to do in terms of briefing our own nation. We had to go back and report back to our House in terms of what they wanted to do. And then we are also really grateful that the Nisga'a Lands government also retained Mr. Jim Aldridge of Aldridge and Associates as our legal counsel. And now when I think about the fact that we went to Scotland without any legal representation, I think it's a little bit crazy. Wouldn't recommend that, but we just didn't know any better. But we did need him in the 3 months after that. There were some decisions that we had made with the board chair that were reneged upon. We had asked to be in the room when the decision was made, and later on they told us no. We had also asked to be part of the to be at the table in order to pick the reviewers of our claim. And I think with our backgrounds, we could have easily done that, but we were told no. We also wanted to review all written materials that were put together by the museum, and we were told no to that. And so we were disheartened to have those no's after the fact, but grateful that we did have Jim Aldridge on side with us. And so it really, in my opinion, we were in a state of uncertainty until we heard back on December 1st from the museum, where they informed us that they were going to give us our totem pole back. With that being said, I know one of the things I've learned since this time is it's important to know your colonizer. And I did my best to sort of make solidarities with the academics of this kind of critical area, and also inform myself of the newspapers and some of the social events that were happening in Scotland. But one of the things I hadn't been aware of was the cultural wars, and how the cultural wars were sort of having a big influence behind the scenes in terms of how this new policy would roll out for the museum. And I'm sure John can talk a little bit about that. But that also impacted some of the no's that we got after the fact. And I think some of the fear, whether it was real or imagined, I don't know, but some of the fear that the museum had in terms of not following the policy for the first time by dotting its I's and crossing its T's. So that was something I learned, was that the social context is always really important, and also that there's always amazing people within these institutions that are doing a lot, and they're taking courageous risks to help you. And so Dr. John Giblin and Shantae St. Inglis have been absolutely amazing in terms of their activism and the risks that they've taken to support us. So just really grateful for that. So this was us first time. I guess we were the first family members since the pole was stolen to actually see it in person. And that's with the museum staff. And so just in August of this year, in 2023, we returned again. And since we had news of the pole coming home, we've had nothing but a positive relationship with the National Museums of Scotland. And so many people have gone above and beyond their jobs in order to get the totem pole home to us. But we also needed to go back a second time in order to support the spiritual preparations needed to bring the pole home. And we had an extended delegation that supported us. We brought another 2 hereditary chiefs, Hlaa and Duke, as well as Mr. Bobby Clark, who was our communications director, that created an extended delegation. And so here's just some photos of that. And one of the other things that really struck us the first time, and so when we went to go do the ceremony just a few months ago, was after we had left our first meeting with the museum and the board chair, we were feeling kind of disheartened, and we went back to where our pole was, and we called witnesses, and there was many people in the gallery that day, and we called them as witnesses as a people of Scotland to help us to know that their national museum was in possession of stolen property, and we needed their help. And we sang some more songs before we left, and what struck me was the little children that came running up to us. Right, and they came running up to us, and they wanted to hear our songs. They wanted to know our language. They wanted to know if they could speak our language. They'd never heard it before. Some of them were too afraid to speak to us. They sent their parents to talk to us. But it was really clear that they knew the difference between right and wrong, and they knew that something shouldn't be stolen. And they said, "We hope that our country gives it back to you." And so when we came back to do our spiritual preparations, we asked that there would be a group of school children as witnesses for their country in terms of that rewriting of that relationship. And so John arranged to have a school of Gaelic school children come, and they acted as witnesses, but they also shared some songs and some of their own histories, which was really beautiful. And so we've had these amazing moments of reconciliation, and I don't often like using that term. I think it's sort of a white liberal term. But I think in terms of the inspiration it's provided to other Canadians, I think it has been a good moment of reconciliation, and we've had many people step in. And so we have some photos, and we've had some experiences. And I don't know, Andrew, if you want to talk about the Canadian Armed Forces. Are you still on? Andrew, are you still on, or did you go to your meeting?
No, we're both, John and I are still on. John's
okay.
on. John's still on.
Okay. Okay. So, do you want to talk a little bit about the Canadian Armed Forces?
Okay. So one of the cool things I think is that when we were coming back from a speech in St. Andrews, Dr. Parent was delivering a speech there, and I was frolicking around in the museum looking at one of the oldest periodic tables ever. But we took taxis back to Scotland after, back to Edinburgh after giving the lecture there. And we were taking taxis, and Ts'aawit Nisga'a and his partner were in a taxi. And you know how they say that there's always truth in all stories, and we got to be careful how we tell them. The reality is we share all parts of our stories. So Ts'aawit Nisga'a and his partner needed the bathroom, and we were coming back in a taxi. So the nearest stop was we pulled over to a McDonald's, and we pulled into this McDonald's on the road between St. Andrews in Scotland and Edinburgh. And when we pulled over, they jumped out to go and use the bathroom. And we were sitting on the side of the highway, and we seen these big jets fly in. And we said, wow, those look like some Canadian jets there too. Wonder what Canada's doing over there. I said, if they give the pole back, maybe we could just load the pole onto one of those planes and they can fly it home for us when they come home. And that's why I think Tamsin was involved in so much of what we do. I think when Amy talked about walking into that room, when we sang the song, the first song we sang to them was called Hiyukwhl. And the chief stood up, and Amy and as the Sigidimnak stood up, and they turned around and showed their crests to the museum facility, to the museum staff. And so the pole could hear that that was the family that pole belonged to. And when you sing that song creates a space that allows the spirits, our oughts and our souls, to know that the people that it belongs to can sing that song and can show their crests, and the pole will know that it's okay for them to come in. And when we sang the next song to them while we were walking in, we sang Enkida. And when they walked up to the top of the steps, you could feel the emotion with the staff in the museum. And at that moment in time, I said to the family, I know we're going to get this pole back, because you can tell that somebody else is working with us. And every single time along the way, we call him Tamsin. He's like our trickster, like Coyote, Raven steals the light type stuff. Tamsin is ours. And it felt like, to me, that Tamsin was always there with us. He was there protecting that pole. He was there making Earl stop to use the bathroom at McDonald's so he could see the Canadian Armed Forces jet. And he was there making sure that all the people that were part of this project knew the right thing to do. It wasn't just about government legislation. It was about us doing a good thing for the world to lay witness to.
Thank you. So I'd like to invite John to share a few words in terms of your perspective.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, everybody. I hope you can hear me. So I will just say a few words around the procedure, where it came from for National Museum Scotland, and maybe where it's going to as well, where we hope it's going to the direction of travel. My role at the museum is to be the head of department for all of the international collections, cultural collections that we hold at the museum. That's around about 150,000 objects or belongings or treasures. And of those, there's about 4,000 that are from North America. But one of my other roles is that I lead the collections area on engaging and acknowledging and addressing our colonial histories and legacies at National Museum Scotland. And as part of those discussions a few years ago, we started working with the executive and with our trustees and talking about the issue of return or repatriation, or in this case, rematriation. And the idea that there would come times where we would identify, or others would identify, belongings or treasures or objects within the collection that were unethically collected, and that there would be communities that would want them returned, and that we at the museum would come to a decision or would be in agreement with them that they were unethically collected and they should be returned. So from once we got consensus around that kind of an idea within the leadership of the museum, we did need to develop a procedure, a legally sound procedure within Scottish law, so that we could follow that and come to, and when we came to decisions, we wouldn't be challenged and have legal challenges. And this is alluding to what Amy mentioned earlier about the so-called culture wars in the UK. Certainly not everybody would be in support of return of cultural belongings and treasures. So we needed to make sure that we were, if we ever did come to those decisions, that we wouldn't be challenged within the UK. So we developed this procedure, we published it in 2021. And in 2022, as you've already heard today, far more eloquently than I could explain, we used that procedure to process the request for the poll. I should say, if anyone is interested in seeing the procedure, that is published online on our website. But also, if you wish to talk to me directly, please do email me at j.giblin@nms.ac.uk, and I'll be very happy to talk about the collections and the procedure in any way that you would like. But I wanted to say that's where we've got some of the past, and that's where we've got to. But I wanted to say something about perhaps the future. So next year, we will review the procedure, and we certainly will be looking to learn from this, which is our first ever rematriation or return of any kind of cultural belonging. And we've always considered this to be a work in progress as a starting point, and we need to learn and adapt along the way. And there's certainly areas that I think we will be addressing immediately. And as already been said today, we need to be able to consider oral testimony as equally valid as written testimony, and that's not in the procedure at the moment. We need to make that explicit. And we also, I think we need to clarify again, what does nation mean? Whereas in this process, we obviously respected the Nisga'a Nation as a nation within a nation. I think we need to make that explicit as well within the procedure and adapt again. And I think also, just in more general terms, and it's again something that Amy mentioned, I think really what I'd like to be able to see, and I hope we'll be able to discuss and find a way of working that means that we don't just enter into this sort of more collaborative working once a decision is made, but that we can be far more collaborative and transparent and engaged throughout, from the moment that, or in advance of a request being made, but once a request is being made, and throughout the decision-making process, which, as Amy has explained, wasn't the case this time. But I hope in the future we can learn from this and develop much more transparent, collaborative methods. So just on those, I will now close. I don't want to speak too long, so I will wrap up. But I would just like to close on the fact that we know that Scottish people will, of course, miss the pole. The pole has been with us for over 90 years in the museum, but the Scottish people are really happy that the pole is back in its rightful place. I am very pleased that to be able to have been in the Nass Valley recently, to see it being returned and amongst its people again where it should be. Just to finish, I would say that from our perspective of our institution, we continue to learn and we continue to be committed to the work, and there's much more for us to do. But thank you, and back over to you, Amy.
So I'll just share a few more pictures of the poll coming home, and then invite Pamela to help wrap up in terms of talking about some of the emotional impacts of the work. So, as Andrew mentioned, we did get our Christmas wish from Prime Minister Trudeau, and we didn't get just one airplane, we got two. The first airplane was too big to land in Theresa, so we had to have a switch off in Trenton and get a smaller plane. So they gratefully came and picked up our totem pole for us. Oh, this doesn't want to go. And Theresa had the great gift of being able to travel the entire time with a totem pole for insurance purposes. And so I won't say, she's actually got 2 nicknames, but I'll share one publicly. The other one I don't think I'm allowed. But we called her Top Gun after that. And when we greeted her, when the pole arrived in Terrace, we brought her some Top Gun, like a movie and things like that. And we tried to play the music for her as well, and the theme song. And we also had a really great partner. Do you want to talk about CBSA?
Yes. So earlier today, Kathy Bershond was presenting for CBSA Canada, Canada Border Services Agency. I just want to express our incredible gratitude to them. They saw the story in the news in December of 2022, after the decision had been made to return the totem pole, and they reached out to us, and they were incredible partners. What's shown on the left is myself and then Loretta Landmesser and 2 other staff from the Indigenous Affairs Secretariat for CBSA, Laura Nesbitt and Cynthia Pye. The flight to Trenton was about 20 hours by the time that photo was taken, because there was a 9-hour drive first from Scotland to England, and then there was a significant plane ride in the C-17, and they arrived. Loretta cut cedar from her own backyard. We had, of course, in transit, the memorial pole had started to look like a somewhat innocuous crate, and that was concerning. Amy at one point had sent me a text saying she'd had a dream and a concern that someone wasn't going to treat the memorial pole correctly, that it was going to be treated like cargo rather than like the ancestor that it is. And so we worked along the way to be able to visually separate the memorial pole from the other things that were being housed, and I'm so grateful to Loretta. And then on the right-hand side, before we left Trenton, there is a young woman, Chelsea Mercer, and that's her young son, who is Nisga'a, and she works for the Canadian Armed Forces out of Trenton. And so she had requested to be able to come, and all of those requests were sent to the family. And so when the family authorized their visits, they were able to come and be a part of the transit.
Thank you. And we had we had a lawyer step in after reading the newspaper article about us, and we need a very specialized shipping lawyer who had knowledge of international law. And so she stepped in and she did pro bono work for us and worked in tandem with CBSA. CBSA also helped us in terms of our last trip. As you know, it's always really challenging to go over the border with our regalia, and our respected chiefs had some priceless regalia with them, and so CBSA really went above and beyond to put a note in the system for us and to ensure that we weren't going to get some of the hassle that we typically get when we have to go through customs and things like that. So we're really grateful for that in terms of their solidarity. And this is the day the pole arrived, and this is our family. And on September 29th, which was the day the totem pole came home, and we had our arrival ceremony and a feast in the Nass Valley, about 700 people there as witnesses. I recall getting a WhatsApp message, and I don't check WhatsApp very often. I don't use it that much. And actually, at first I thought it was some kind of creepy guy. But it was actually this picture coming in from Mr. Angus Robertson, who had promised us in August that he was going to fly the Nisga'a flag at the Scottish Parliament on the day it came home. And so he kept his promise. And here's some photos of our arrival ceremony. And it was quite interesting. Andrew observed, he was also our orator that day in the MC, and he talked about, we talked about the storm that took the poles away. But then on the day the pole came home, we had absolute sunshine right as they opened the crate of the box, and we felt like that was also spirit guiding us. And here's some respected matriarchs from our house seeing our pole for the first time. And we had a representative from the government of Scotland, Mr. John Devine, who came, as well as that's our Nisga'a president, Eva Clayton, on the right there. And then we have a representative from the Crown Indigenous, CERNAC, I can't remember how you spell it, Crown Indigenous Relations. And so that's the Canadian Government Department for Treaty Nations. And we had multiple generations of women from our house stand up as we talked about rematriation. And here's some of the little ones from our house. We call them our little tadpoles, our little frogs. And we didn't have any professional pictures for the one on the right here. I think Theresa has them. I didn't get them on time, but it's some personal photos of the totem pole right after it had been raised in the Nisga'a Museum. So it was quite the feeling. I've never had that feeling before, but it felt a little bit like spiritual labor. And as the hat went on the pole, it was just a big sigh of relief, and really grateful as well. We had an amazing collaboration with the Museum of Anthropology out of UBC. And so their technical team supported us in addition to the technical team that came from the National Museums of Scotland. So Theresa, do you want to say anything in terms of just other dimensions that might be supportive of other people who'd like to rematriate or repatriate?
I'll just make a couple of quick comments because I know we're getting our time close, and I know Pamela is going to close us out, and I'm sure there's some questions. I just want to highlight a couple of things that Amy said, but maybe say them in a different way. Amy, through her grant research, had hired a publicist, and ultimately that publicist came to be the publicist for the family, and then the nation utilized the same publicist. It was critical to the success of this effort, both in terms of the access to media outlets, the planning of stories, the planning of interviews, so that the narrative could be held within the family from the beginning. That got a little bit tense with Scotland, as Amy mentioned, when it was mentioned that there was going to be additional interviews based on what Scotland had decided. But the fact that that was lined up was incredibly useful. The second thing I want to point out is the publication Amy mentioned, so herself working with Ts'aawit to write in an edited volume published by an academic press, allowed the National Museum of Scotland to use published material that was the story told by the family, rather than using the publications of Marius Barbeau and other anthropologists from the early 1900s when they made their written case or their written evaluation of the family's oral presentation. And so the use of that, or the bridge of that, Amy as an academic scholar, I think was an Indigenous academic scholar and also connected to the family, was also critical. One of the other things I just want to quickly mention is Amy mentioned a time of uncertainty when it wasn't quite clear whether the Scottish National Museum was going to, it had become this sort of black box where they were not allowing the family to review the case that they had, their evaluation of the family's case. There wasn't family input into the reviewers that would review their work. At that same time, it was not known that the National Museum Scotland was going to accept the sovereignty of the Nisga'a Nation. And their policy includes within it a clause that if you're rejected for any reason, you cannot reapply for 5 years. And so there was an incredible amount of skepticism of their process, that after 3 months that they could say, oh, you're not an entity that can apply, get back to us in 5 years. And so we approached them in the middle of that process, the attorney Jim Aldridge, in a meeting, and they clarified that yes, in fact, they had moved forward with that as a reality, but that wasn't shared with the nation or with the family at the front end. And then the last thing I'll mention, Amy, or reinforce what Amy said, was she mentioned that you need a good team. I think there was the team that became, the delegation that became the team, or the sort of, it was very organically formed. Of course, the family efforts, Amy's academic efforts, and then other family members joining. But then one of our delegate members is not able to attend today because of cultural responsibilities. He's the chief councillor for the village of Laxgalt'sap, but also an elected member of the national government. And so the ability for the political structure of the nation to be represented was critical because he played a very diplomatic role, but he's also, what's the word for your paternal side? His Wilp-Adokshl, yes. He's also a relative of Chief Earl's on his paternal side, which is the part of the family that cares for them in times of stress and grief and other cultural responsibilities. And so he served these two roles. Chief Earl served multiple roles, bringing the legacy forward of his ancestors, but also presenting the raw emotion in the present of the memorial pole needing to come home. Amy served multiple roles, that academic role, and then the matriarch of the Wilp. Andrew Robinson served multiple roles. He was there to support, there as a member of the national government. He was the orator, as Amy mentioned, but he is one of those individuals able to speak loudly and clearly and with humor and charisma, and made this learning experience for the representatives from the Natural Museum Scotland comfortable, even though at the same time he was creating a space where the delegation took precedence and it wasn't the agenda of the National Museum Scotland. I think all of those things were really critical. My own role was to bring the fact that I've worked for most of my career in colonial museum institutions, and to be able to watch and witness and offer insight to the family about what kinds of conversations the National Museum staff might be happening, so that as we created the strategy of rejecting their policy as relevant, identifying that as a living ancestor, which is the family and the nation's Hiyukwhl, their traditional laws, that this is not an object. Amy would say, this is not an object, this is not a thing. This is not your property. You cannot own our ancestor. Those were critical conversations that we all brought pieces together for. And so even though it formed organically, I think it has components that I would encourage people as they consider their efforts in approaching these other institutions and organizations overseas, of bringing together people that have those strengths that can shift the conversation so that it's not the institution deciding that their policy is what you have to follow, because you have the power to change that conversation, but who you bring will matter in terms of how you shift that narrative.
Hello, my Nisga'a Lands, Max Gak, Shining White Swan from the Wolf Clan, Wilps. I'd like to thank you for the invite, for allowing us to be a part in this repatriation conference. I stand with my fiance right beside me here as he rematriated their ancestral memorial totem pole. These past few years, I've been beside him.
Could you try again?
Siri. Sorry. Siri's asking me a question. Okay. I have been beside him, providing him the emotional support to cope with all the emotions that he's encountered along the way to rematriate the pole, and has been numerous emotional roller coaster ride. And I'd like to say, watching the pictures and listening to our people here, it really just brings it back. It's only been 5 weeks since the totem pole has been in our Nisga'a Nation, and we really never even had downtime to really have it sink in. But coming here for this conference has helped us, make us realize that we all need to work together. And we are definitely looking forward to more ancestors, totem poles, and belongings being repatriated back to the Nisga'a Nation. May we all stand as one, working together to right the wrongs and to step into your power or our power for our ancestors 7 generations back and 7 generations forward. What we've done, as Amy has mentioned, is that always follow your heart. Having the totem pole back in the Nisga'a Nation, we feel that the piece of us has come. And we're looking forward to more of our pieces come back to our nation so we can be whole. Doigsanin.
So I know we're getting a little short on time, but if there are any questions, just can't ask me how old I am.
I wanted to give you some feedback as people may possibly be coming to the microphones. The group here in the chat has been learning a lot from you guys, and I just wanted to let you know that. They really appreciated conversation and found inspiration in a lot of the things that you were saying regarding, you know, coming at requests for what you expect and really holding firm to those. There was a conversation in here about the importance of terminology and how tribal sovereignty should be respected when you want something to be referred to as something or someone to be referred to as someone. That's incredibly important. They wanted me to express to you how thankful they were for you to be sharing your story talk with them today, so that they could learn these lessons.
Hi. Oh, this is a bit low. Hi. Thank you so much for that, and thank you for sharing your story. This is a question to all of you, and also be interested to hear from John as well. The strategy was, as Theresa kind of succinctly put it, was to reject that the procedure was relevant. And John's obviously mentioned that next year they're reviewing the procedure. How do European institutions ensure that they are acting ethically, morally, in the interests of the nation and following what the nation wants, but kind of applying that fairly? Can they do that without a procedure? You know, obviously they have done it without a procedure, but I guess, what am I trying to say? If you reject the procedure, the procedure's there to apply it fairly for all nations, how do you move forward with other claims? I'm not wording that very well.
Amy organized a session that was moderated by Canada's UNESCO Commission, and we talked a little bit about this question there. I personally think there should be a section of the policy that is adapted in every situation. So according to, not to precede what John might say, but they do have a sort of the case-by-case language in there. But there really needs to be more adaptability and flexibility in there. If you've developed a policy and do not have a committee of Indigenous advisors that are reviewing that policy, how can you possibly consider it complete in terms of a policy that's going to apply to Indigenous peoples from around the world that are going to come and make claims? And so we sometimes create boundaries where there don't need to be. There could be an appendix in the policy that gets written in concert, in collaboration with each nation that comes forward to request their belongings. I mean, I think there's lots of ways that they could do it to make it flexible. But honestly, if you're developing a policy as an institution and you do not have Indigenous people at the table reviewing and or contributing directly to that policy, shame on you.
Yeah, I think it's like nothing about us without us is always hugely important. And then I just also think about it's not just policy, it's people behind the policies, and that's where my educational background comes in. And you know, I think it's also one of education. And one of the most profound moments of vulnerability, which I do have permission to share because they've gone on film and shared it, and was Shantae St. Inglis talking about how it really wasn't until they journeyed to the Nass after we heard back from the museum that they're going to have a poll back, and so they came about 3 months later to our Nisga'a New Year and also to visit our museum to begin the technical preparations for the poll to come home. And she said it really wasn't until she came to the Nass and experienced her culture and met, you know, hundreds of our community members and saw how we lived and how important that totem pole was for us, that she had to reflect and think about how transactional she had been in terms of the interpretation of that policy. And she's a very kind and amazing person. But she said when she first met us that she was just really thinking kind of through the boxes and following the policy itself. But I do believe that everybody has power. And it's particularly people in these privileged positions, if they're educated in better ways in order to think about how they can push these boxes and how they can negotiate and some of the kind of binaries that they put themselves in, I think that's also really important. And so on our last trip, we went to the University of Glasgow, and there I had an opportunity to engage with some of the museum professionals who deliver graduate programming, and so they were speaking my language a little bit more, and so we were talking shop a little bit, but I think it's also, you know, there's also roles within these educational programs for museum professionals, particularly in Europe, where it should be sort of vital that they have more training around engagement with Indigenous peoples and what that might look like in terms of rethinking these policies, but also forming relationships with us, you know, and actually getting to know who we are. And I think, you know, there's ways that we can kind of solve that in terms of that extra layer of relationality that's needed in terms of the interpretation of the policies. So, John, would you like to speak?
I will do, but Andrew has his hand up, so I'll let him go first.
Thank you, John. I really appreciated the question, and there was a few things that were mentioned there, and I just wanted to touch on them quickly. First off, the truth about stories is that's all we are. Thomas King always said it best. I love that thing because the truth about stories is reflective of where we are in history. And the truth about this story is where Scotland, the Nisga'a Nation, the Government of Canada, and British Columbia stood beside Nisga'a and his family to retell a story that history can share. The truth about that is more powerful than anything else, and that policies are forgotten in time. The truth in this story is about a new relationship and a new path forward, about people respecting one another based on good, comprehensive communications that sometimes hit a bit of a wall. But at the same time, we were still in the same room looking at each other's face to face and addressing it. Somebody mentioned in the chat about the importance of terminology. Unbeknownst to many people at this table, I was 21 years old when I came back. And I was the little kid that was sitting here with the Nisga'a Nation, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed with my first university degree, beginning to work with a guy to negotiate the custodial agreements for the items that would come back to the Nisga'a Museum. And I was sitting in front of a delegation of folks from the British Columbia Museum, and I went in there and they had this big pile of papers on the table that were the list of all of our items. And they were talking to us about how we were going to get them back and how they were going to discuss how we would receive them. And I said, that's funny. I said, you can come into our lands and steal our stuff. Steal our ceremonial items, steal our pizza, steal our longhouses, steal all of our stuff, steal death, burial regalia. And then you tell me that you're going to create the rules. I said, how can a thief create the rules? And the lady looked at me across the table and she, no diplomacy whatsoever, 21 years old, thinking that I could conquer the world. And she said, she thanked me. She said, it's the first time in a long time that somebody actually sat across the table from her and told her the truth. And she said, it's hard for people to swallow, But you want to know what? I applaud the National Museum of Scotland for honoring the truth, for respecting the truth, and respecting that it was up to them to change the story and share it so time could tell the proper story. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. I'll jump in next then. I can't see the audience, but I do recognize the voice of the question asker. I believe that might be Amy Shakespeare. So hello, Amy. Thank you very much for your question. It is very difficult. It is a very difficult situation. We are in a legal situation within Scotland. And as the other Amy, Dr. Amy Parent has said many times, there was a collision of different world views. We are operating in a legal system within Scotland, within the UK, and we are doing our best to navigate that system. And I would add that we are the first national museum within the UK to have a policy and procedure that can even make this happen at all. But as I said in my bit earlier, this is a work in progress. It's come from a place that's well-meaning, but there's a lot of work to be done to make it more open, more transparent, more collaborative as a process, but we still have to do that within a legal system within the UK that is, as legal systems are, constraining to a degree. So I don't really have the perfect answer for you, but as as Andrew says, we're working together, we're collaborating together, we're looking forward to our future relationships and to changing those stories of the past for the better of the future. And I'll just have to leave it there, I think, at the moment, and to say that, as I said, we're committed to doing the work, we're committed to learning.
Thank you. Thank you.